Genshin Impact Drama。
同时，为了感谢旅行者们在过去1年里的支持与陪伴，我们还将通过游戏内邮件的方式为旅行者们奉上3个纠缠之言。
I'll kick you in the nuts and you'll smile at me and like it and show me some respect.
So, unless you have been living under a rock, you probably know of the current Genshin drama that's been going on. And every day we get something new. Content creators from 1 subscriber to 4 million subscribers have given their take on this, including the contracted whoever CCs. Though their takes were kinda meh, not gonna lie. And I'm here to do the same, cause at this point, this isn't just drama anymore. No. It's a goddamn movement.
Goddamn right.
But hey, even though we may have differing opinions, we can all agree that this bald man is farming.
Attention!
Every day, this man uploads 4 videos covering the movement while shining his majestic bald head in our faces. Sometimes, I don't even focus on the video because I'm so mesmerized by his baldness. On a serious note though, it's kinda suspicious that the movement was almost becoming as big as the first anniversary, but out of nowhere, contracted CCs started attacking Baldy as if to direct attention someplace else. Now, I'm not commenting on who is right or wrong, but it does seem suspicious. Anyway, back to the main topic. Now, let's be honest, you might not like him or even agree with him on most things. Heck, even I don't agree with a lot of stuff he says on his podcast and wish I was there to discuss that. But he is right about at least one thing, and that is feeling respected. We can all agree that free fates ain't it, right? You know what? It's not even about the rewards anymore at this point. It's about the lack of communication. So let's address everything that's been going on one by one, and there might be some controversial takes in this, but I'm open to discussing about them in the comment section. So, right off the bat, I will say that this drama is now over, because even CN players are not doing anything about it anymore. And why do I say this? Well, let's check their Douyin account and see the latest post. 30k likes and the comments, they all seem pretty positive to me. The 3 million follower loss initially was just that, a one-time thing, and didn't have any effect whatsoever. Hoyo botted their followers again anyway, so they are reading good. And not to mention, Xianyun Day 1 banner sales. She literally surpassed everyone, and let's be honest, she ain't even that good. On the EN side of things, we got infighting, people fighting with each other instead of focusing on the main issue. And Hoyo is getting away with it again, because now the attention has been shifted from what should be talked about to CC this and CC that. Originally, everyone was focused on getting that change, with CC after CC finally talking about it. Most of the big ones did address it in some way or another. Whether I agree with their POV or not, that's a different thing. But the point is, they did address it. Now, I will say that I love this game. The music, the exploration, the gameplay, everything I absolutely love. But it does have some issues, with the most glaring one being the lack of communication. I'll be the first one to say that I wouldn't give as much of a fuck about the rewards if we were getting what we have been asking for. Endgame, quality of life updates, repeatable event quests, the list goes on. But all we have gotten so far is all of that being put into star rating. And speaking of endgame, the most common reason I hear about not having endgame is casual player base, and they don't like fighting. First of all, the player base doesn't like fighting? Really? But jokes aside, I agree with the statement that most of the player base is casual and doesn't even like events where they have to engage in hard combat. Heck, they don't even like Spiral Abyss. And yes, that's 100% true. These people do ignore the Spiral Abyss and hardcore events. But let me rewrite the statement from my point of view. The player base is casual and doesn't even like events where they are forced to engage in hard combat. These people already ignore the Abyss, so I don't believe they will mind it if there is another endgame mode for people that want to do it. Considering it doesn't give Primogem rewards, they can continue ignoring that mode as well. Cause I'll be honest, at this point, I just want a challenge, and I'm cool with no Primogems as rewards. I would in fact love it if we got Mora, Wits, Enhancement Ores, or even Artifact EXP from it, cause we are doing that endgame mode, right? Which means we do build characters and require those mats. I believe that's a win-win scenario for all. all. And just a side note, if you are on Twitter tweeting something like, I am a casual and don't like endgame, then I'll be honest, that's just a lie. Cause by definition, a casual player has a job and a life to even be online fighting about this stuff. Another claim I hear from people is Genshin is a story-based game, so it doesn't need combat stuff. And that statement is partially true, cause it does have a good story indeed, but it is an action role-playing game, and by definition, it needs action or combat to fit in that category. And not to mention, if it was just a story-based game, why does it require me to log in every day? Otherwise, I risk missing something. Just think about it. Why do I need to log in daily and grind if it's just a story game like you say? That isn't something a story-based game does. Story-based games have a long and cohesive story which you can enjoy at your own pace instead of feeling FOMO. Another problem is lack of quality of life updates, and this, I feel, is something the whole community agrees on. I see people in the comment section getting super excited for any quality of life updates we get, and hey, that's good, that's really good that we're finally getting those updates. But my problem is, those quality of life updates should have been implemented in the game 3 years ago. Case in point, claim and dispatch all expeditions. That feature was heavily requested in the game for a long time, and we finally got it, that's good. But the problem is still there. It took 3 years to get that one single update. And there was also another update of getting daily commissions which have a world quest associated with them or something like that. I don't remember exactly. But the problem still remains that we aren't getting as many QOLs as we should be getting. Everything is getting implemented in Star Rail. And I do have some theories as to why the community isn't getting the stuff they want. But I will discuss those later. Also, to the people who defend Genshin's rewards, I just have a single question for you all. Why are you all literally against the entire community? Because think about it, if we do get good rewards, then it's not like the people who were complaining will be the only ones to get them. Everyone will, meaning a win for the community as a whole. But you know what, maybe these people don't want that, because then more people will have their waifu Hu Tao and they can't stand that, right? So finally, why don't we get the changes we so rightly deserve? I have 3 theories for that. The first one is what everyone's been yapping about how Genshin is too big to fail and doesn't need to change. Previously, I used to believe that the community did have some power when we got Zhongli buffed and Tectone got the weapon banner changed. But ever since the Dia incident, I don't think that's the case. Considering how many controversies Genshin has been a part of, be it characters, gameplay, rewards, you name it, I feel like Hoyoverse has just learned to manage the backlash by simply ignoring it. It has worked for them until now, so there is literally no point in changing. My second theory, specifically for not getting QOLs, is rigid code. We all know how the Genshin team was just a bunch of noobs when they made the game, right? With no experience. So I believe that their code is unoptimized. And at this point, the code is so big that it cannot be optimized easily, considering the 6-week update cycle they are on. If they do change something, it breaks stuff. To show you an example of this, I made this small application for a Genshin game mode Tectone invented 2 years back. And if I were to change one letter in this, then this is the result. So yeah, implementing quality of life updates might be tough for them, but from a consumer point of view, it's not good enough of an excuse. And the final theory for not getting change is straight up stolen from another game I used to play called Pokemon Go. The devs in that game simply do not care about what people want. Every event they do is broken. They never give the community what they want and are basically taking the game in a direction they want and not the community. I feel Genshin is basically taking the same route because they have a vision for what the game should be, and anything other than that said by the community is ignored. So, do I think we are getting a change? Doubt it. Do I think there's going to be another outrage soon? I think there's a chance because February 10 is the Lunar New Year date, so maybe we might see something from China that day. But you know what would be crazy? What would be insane? What would drive the Genshin community nuts? If Star Rail gives us something on Lunar New Year, because they didn't mention anything about the Lunar New Year rewards. They just said, here's the regular 10 bull and here's another one for the new planet. Honestly, it can even be a single pull and that'll set the community on fire. But hey, at the end, when Genshin is done, when Genshin is finished, we will either have videos of why Genshin was so popular or how Genshin dug its own grave. And finally, before I go, I have one thing to say.
I should be the only getting praised in this community because I don't spend money.